we're now going to look at linking reserves up to our cost codes, meaning that when we allocate transactions, so payments and receipts, to cost codes that are linked to reserves, the reserve balances will automatically update. Now that is done in the setup menu in cost codes, but firstly we need to make sure that they all exist. It works well to have a separate cost center for your reserves. You don't have to do this, but it does keep things nice and simple, and the reports are very easy to see what's related to your reserves on Scribe. So if you want to add a new cost center, if you haven't got one already, then you would just come into here, click plus to add a new record at the top, enter in the name, so reserves, earmarked reserves, whatever you want to call it, and just click add. I already have one called earmarked reserves here, so that means I can allocate all my cost codes for my reserves to show in that, and that keeps things very simple in the system. So once we've done that, you can then think about your cost code sitting under your cost center for your earmarked reserves, and then we can link them up to our reserves that we've set up in the system. Now, if you already have some cost codes that relate to reserves, then all we need to do is link them up. If you haven't, then you need to add them in. So again, to add a new one in, we would just click plus at the top here. It would take the next available number in the system. That's absolutely fine unless you use any specific numbering, in which case you would just need to allocate it appropriately. Remember, it needs to be unique. The cost code is the cost code name, so that can simply be the reserve that you're doing, that you're linking it to. So I've got one for works to Village Pond. If you don't have a separate cost center that it's going to sit under, you may want to prefix the cost code name with something like EMR to distinguish that it's very clearly reserve related. But if it's going to sit under a separate cost center, as mine is here under earmarked reserves, then it's reasonably obvious. The important bit here then is the link that we're going to create under this field for reserve. So by clicking into here, we can see all the reserves that we have set up under our setup menu, and then we can select which one we would like to link it to. So in this scenario, this is Works to Village Pond, and it's linked to the same reserve. There are two important things to note here. One is that you can link multiple codes to a reserve if you want to. Generally, the relationship works to be one-on-one, so you'd have one cost code linked to one reserve, but you can have multiple ones if you want to. And sometimes if you have a really big project going on, so if you were building a community centre or something, you may find it useful to break it down across multiple cost codes that you can all link to the same reserve. Secondly, the thing to note is that once you've linked a cost code to a reserve, all the transactions allocated to that cost code within the financial year that you created the link in will go against the reserve. It doesn't start from the point at which you link it. It looks back at everything that's happened in the financial year where you're making that link. Moving on then, we do have a balance brought forward and field against the cost code, but I wouldn't suggest that you put anything in here. This was from the old reserves method that was on Scribe prior to this, and now you're going to have that opening balance you've set up against the reserve, so you don't need to represent anything in here. And also just talk about the budget as well. So there is no relationship on Scribe between the budget of a cost code linked to a reserve and the reserve opening balance. That's because it depends how you want to represent it on your reports and what is going to actually happen with the spend from the reserve pot. You might be in a scenario where you're simply saving up the reserve pot to do some work, so you might be putting some money aside, and in 5 years' time the project's going to start. Therefore, there wouldn't be appropriate to have a budget in this financial year if we're not actually going to spend anything against the reserve. We're just saving up. You might have a scenario where you actually got a reserve pot and all of that money is going to be spent in this year. The project's going to be completed in a single year, and therefore you could have the payment budget equal to the reserve balance. Or you might have a scenario somewhere in the middle where you've got some money in a reserve and some of it's planned to be spent, and you might want to represent it as the budget. So you just need to give some consideration how you might want to reflect that, because this payment budget will show on the summary report in order that you can see the actual transactions against your reserves. So in this scenario, I'm not going to show a budget in here, and therefore I can click add, and it appears in the list, and I now have this cost code linked to the reserve. We can take a look at what that will look like by going to summary reports. Now here's our summary report. So that's our budgets showing versus our actuals. And if we scroll down, we can see we've got our separate section for earmarked reserves, so I can come in here and see the actual transactions that are taking place. Some of them I may have a budget, some I may not. As I said, my village pond, I don't have one in here. Remember, in here, this will only ever show you the actual transactions that are taking place in this financial year, so the payments and receipts that are allocated to these codes. To get the full picture of your reserves, so exactly what's happening with regards to opening balances and any transfers, as well as these actual transactions, you would always need to use the reserves balance report. So I'd recommend that if you're running the summary report and seeing this information, you supplement it with the reserves balance, because that will give you the full picture of everything that you are doing.